Ooh, ah, Shannon's Lumber Industry Update.
Hi everybody, welcome back to the show, to episode 163, where this time I'm going to feature Red Alder. I'm actually surprised it took me so long to get to this species, but it kind of makes sense because it was a species that I discovered pretty late in my woodworking journey, if you will. And it is actually a pretty common species. Most of my woodworking has always been on the East Coast. I started woodworking when I lived on the East Coast. When I lived out in Colorado, I wasn't really doing any woodworking. And this is a Pacific wood that doesn't really show up much out east. But that has changed a little bit recently, and I've been exposed to red alder a fair bit over the last couple of years. So it just seemed logical that I talk about it now. But also in this episode, it has been cold all across the country, and I've been seeing stories popping up about freezing trees. Look out for freezing trees. So I had some people ask about that. So I'm going to talk about it. And then we're certainly going to focus on alder, but then we're going to do a little bit of talk about walnut, some various grades, some of the industry trends that's happening with it. I've featured walnut on the show before, but some things have developed since then, and some interesting questions have come in about walnut. So, ideally, an action-packed show. We're going to talk about a lot of different stuff, a really cool wood species. If you don't have exposure to it, you should get some exposure, and a species that a lot of us have exposure to, but may not know some of the things about buying it and sourcing it, and potentially internationally sourcing walnut. So let's move into the frigid news, exploding trees. So I laugh. For those of you who don't know, I did some studies actually in climatology, meteorology, and general atmospheric physics when I was in college. There was a part of me that thought that it might be fun to go into the weather world, but I never wanted to go into weather forecasting. I wanted to be that guy from The Day After Tomorrow, Dennis Quaid, who was a climatologist and studied stuff. But I think my math skills just weren't up to par. Long story short, weather has always fascinated me, but I always joke about how weather has become the sensationalist entertainment business. And when snow comes around, you get terms like snowpocalypse and snowmageddon and the blizzard in the century. And lately, with this polar vortex, that's a real meteorological term, but there's certainly a fair bit of sensationalism in that. The polar vortex has brought warnings about exploding trees. Careful where you park because the tree can explode and it can fall on top of you. And I've seen a variety of memes popping up where people have actually used special effects to make trees literally explode, like a guy walking by it and there's this ball of flames. I've seen the traditional action hero like casually walking away from the explosion behind him, but there's a tree and explodes. All in good fun, but is this a real thing? And I've had several of you who written in and said, is it a real thing? Well, I found this graphic somewhere on the internet. I wish I could give credit to somebody, but it was like Instagram or something and there was no attribution for it. So I grabbed it because it's a nice infographic that explains it. If you know anything about trees or wood, it's hydrophilic. Trees especially are full of water, like 85, 95% moisture content. Usually 90 to 95%, not 85%. That's probably a dying tree at 85%. So there's a lot of water in there. Now, some of that may be in the form of sap. Some of it just may be plain old water. And that's in the outer layers of the tree. So you can imagine as the temperature drops rapidly, even the insulating properties of the tree and the bark might actually cause problems and could cause that water to freeze. Well, when water freezes, it expands. So the graphic that I'm showing here, basically you can see that line of water on the outside of the tree starts to freeze and expand rapidly. So you get this almost like delamination or shake where the rings of the tree start to expand and they separate from one another and they crack apart and can actually cause the trunk to splinter. Now, what you're going to find is the weak parts of the trunk, probably right at that first branching of the crotch is where you might find that instability, and the cantilevered weight of a branch or something could essentially crack and fall off and, land on your house, land on your car, land on your head, land on power lines, etc. So I don't really know much about the temperatures required to do this. It's been about 9 degrees most of the week here, but that's not cold enough. I haven't heard or seen any exploding trees. Maybe up in Minnesota, maybe up in northern parts of Canada, it's been a problem. I think the bigger issue is not so much the degree pun intended, of the temperature, like how cold it is, but how quickly it gets that cold. So going back to that movie, The Day After Tomorrow, where the polar vortex dumps air down from the stratosphere and helicopters froze in the sky and fell from the sky because jet fuel froze. It was the rate with which it exploded that caused that massive expansion. And that's what actually caused, that is what has been causing, quote, exploding trees. The water can freeze inside the tree, and I've actually spoken about sawing frozen logs before and how it can actually be somewhat advantageous. But when it freezes rapidly, the tree doesn't have time to respond and expands too quickly, causing that ring shake where, well, delamination at the growth rings. And that's where exploding trees come from. So there you go. For the 4 or 5 of you that asked about it, it is a thing. It's not nearly sensationalist as, go figure, the internet has made it out to be. But yeah, it is a thing. I got some other news and stuff, but honestly, the news in the world is kind of depressing right now. So I'm going to jump into my featured species, alder. Specifically, red alder, Alnus rubra. Now, I say that because alder is a global species. Well, global-ish. It grows in Europe, it grows in some parts of Asia, and it grows in North America. As far as I know, there's not an alder, an Alnus genus, or Alnus species somewhere in South America or in Africa. I could be wrong. I didn't dig too deeply on that. But there is essentially 2 primary species. There is red alder, what we're talking about today, Alnus rubra, and we're also going to run into things like European alder or Alnus glutinosa. There isn't a massive difference, and this is typical of things like some of the beeches and some of the birches and some of the even the walnuts and oaks that you see in Europe, but you also see in North America. There will be some differences. I do find that European alder is more weather resistant, more of an exterior wood. And actually, fun fact about European alder, it's actually what has been used as the marine pilings in Venice, Italy. It's holding up Venice. It's a big job. Red alder, interestingly enough, it does well when in constant contact with water, but when there's constant wetting and drying, not so well. I wouldn't really rate red alder as an exterior species, but put a pin in that because I'll come back to that. There's areas where you might actually think it could be exterior. Often referred to as poor man's cherry, and I've actually got a couple pieces of alder right here on screen. And for the most part, we're talking about, in this light, it looks quite white, and it is a pretty pale alder. But think of cherry almost like a bleached cherry, or cherry that is like closer to the sapwood of cherry with just a hint of pink in it. And certainly you can put a finish on alder and it will take on some of those warmer pinky red tones. But one of the things about alder is there is a difference between the heartwood and the sapwood in color, but it's not nearly as stark as you would find in cherry. So we find that more of the board can sometimes be usable because it can blend into heartwood a little bit more, which has actually been a bit of a competitive advantage for it. Where alder often gets used a lot is in products like knotty alder. And I've got a board here on camera that has a knot in it. Here's another board with a knot in it. And finally, a third board with a knot on both faces. So for those of you listening, I have 4 pieces of alder, about 6 inches wide and about 36 inches long. One of them is entirely clear. That's not true. There's actually a tiny little pin knot on the other one. And the other 3, all are select-tight knots. Well, this is on the border of select-tight and not. But for the most part, there are knots in the tree. And knotty alder is I don't want to say a grade, but a product all its own. Often you find it in kitchen cabinetry and things like that. It is very common the way alder grows for it to branch quickly, and you will tend to find knotty grades. That doesn't mean you can't get clear. I've certainly seen clear. These are relatively small cuttings, but I also think that adds a little distinction. There's a slightly rustic feel to alder as compared to something like cherry. The converse of that is I have a block of cherry here. Now this cherry has had plenty of time to oxidize, so it's got that kind of deep red brown. And when I put the alder next to it, there is a stark difference. In some ways, you might even think I'm holding a piece of maple instead of alder in one hand. It does look like a white wood. And the lighting in here is fun and moody for a podcast, but not the best for color matching on wood. Obviously, when I'm woodworking and finishing, I turn on all the overhead daylight lights, and you will certainly see more of that kind of tan caramel brown color that comes from it. So you might call it as like a light brown to creamy color. And it does finish to more of a darker red brown. But the thing is, if you set the color aside, the grain is almost identical to cherry. And if you look at the in grain and the porosity of it, you'll find that it's, again, almost identical to cherry, which is why it's been called poor man's cherry. Well, why poor man's cherry? Well, for the most part, these days, you're going to find it around $3 a board foot. So compare that to like $6.50, $7 a board foot for 4-quarter cherry, and it's half the price. So poor man's cherry. But what's interesting is it is currently one of the most in-demand hardwoods in its region, in the Pacific Northwest and the West Coast. There's not a lot of poplar growing out there, but alder kind of fills in the blank for poplar. And poplar is kind of that secondary wood, a paint grade wood. I actually think it's easier to work. It's not as stringy as poplar, and it works like a softer version of cherry. It's an absolute pleasure to work with, especially like the way I work with hand tools. So it's really started to grab hold of the market, and there's been greater distribution of it across the West Coast to the point where it's actually started to make it out east. And I now have suppliers that are regularly stocking alder out here on the East Coast. So and the other part of this is we're exporting it now. China has discovered it. Parts of Asia have discovered it. And there is now actually an export market, which has created a little bit of demand for alder, which has helped to stabilize it and make more sawmills interested in cutting it. Historically, I'd say alder's probably at a high, but it's not a spiky wood as far as market price. It's very stable. It has been a slow climb, and really, into 2025, I would call it about maybe 650 per 1,000 board foot on like a log to wholesale-ish price, and then retail about $3 a board foot in your West Coast markets. I've seen it out here in some distributors where it's closer to like $4.50 because of, I guess, just the transportation from the West Coast to here. But because that supply chain is very well established, it's really defined by ample inventory and major producers. The good news is the Pacific Northwest, they love timber. They're into timber. They're good at processing timber. So there are lots of foresters and concession management entities up there. There are concentration yards and sawmills that can process the volume. So all of that industry to back it up keeps sufficient log availability, but also sufficient supply. So it keeps that price really stable, but also competitive. If another thing starts to horn in on it because there was a sudden glut of a species and prices start to drop, alder can kind of hold its own, and it's not going to drop in relation to a more expensive species dropping. It's going to stay pretty steady. So by saying right now about $3 a board foot, I could probably record this same episode in 10 years, and it'll be somewhere in that same range. And if you go back historically, you'll see a very, very similar number. $2 was not unheard of like 15 years ago when I started working in this business. So to have it climb $1 a board foot in 15 to 20 years, that is stable, folks. That is very stable. The demand really closely tied to the furniture industry, the cabinet, specifically the kitchen cabinet industry, and kind of somewhat, you would just say generically interior millwork. You will sometimes see it used for moldings. The somewhat knotty nature of it means that you're not really getting long 12, 15 foot clear runs of it, but in more rustic interior millwork applications, alder can be very popular. And like I said, there's been a strong export interest to Asia and even Europe. Even though Alnus glutinosa is there, the red alder is clearer than the European alder, so there has been some demand there. Not a lot of demand in Japan, although I've heard from some of my sawmills out west that some people, they have gotten some inquiries from Japan because Japan obviously loves cherry, Japanese cherry, etc., and they're starting to explore into the alder market. So that could be another demand on the alder market there. Like I said, its appeal comes from its physical working properties. It's super easy to work with. Its hardness is 590. So when you compare that to cherry at about 900, really nice, almost half, maybe 2/3. Yeah, more like 2/3 of the hardness. And I personally love working with cherry, but cherry, due to the diffuse porous and kind of tighter grain, denser structure, feels a lot harder than its 900 Janka hardness. Like cherry and black walnut have the same Janka hardness, but walnut feels substantially softer under the chisel, under the saw, etc., because of the porosity. Walnut being semi-ring porous, cherry being diffuse porous, and just being tighter packed matrix of lignin. Alder has that same close grain, tighter packed pores and tighter lignin matrix, but with that 590 Janka hardness, now it's like working poplar, but without the stringy nature of it. MOR not particularly high, 9,800. MOE 1.3 or 1.4 million. This is not a wood that you're going to use for bending and for really structural purposes. Tangential movement is 7.3, radial 4.4, so you got a 1.6 TR ratio. Pretty standard for temperate hardwoods. But it's lightweight, 28 pounds per cubic foot, which is on par. It's lighter than poplar, not by much, but we'll just say comparable, and maybe like 5 pounds heavier than like a softwood like Western red cedar or something like that. So as I said, the ingrain is almost indistinguishable from cherry. They're both diffuse porous, very small pores. You can find some kind of groupings of 2s and 3s in alder, whereas cherry tends to be a little bit more solitary pore arrangement. The big difference with alder is it, like cherry, it's got really, really small medullary rays, but alder tends to clump them together in what's called aggregate rays. So you get like 5 or 6 rays all clumped together in what looks like one big fat ray, but under magnification, you'll see there's like 5 different rays all clumped together. So every now and then you'll see that, and of course I've got flat sawn boards here. Let me see if I can find a bit of grain that's a little bit quartered. Yeah, so as I look, I mean, you guys are never going to see this on the camera, and for those listening, it doesn't really matter anyway. But as I look at the end grain, I can see like a thick line here or there, and you might actually mistake it for like a growth ring, like the late growth of the groat ring, the late growth of the groat ring. But if you look closer, you'll see there is a late growth line and an early growth band, and there's this little band of aggregate ray. But on the surface, on the quartered board, like cherry, it's pretty much invisible. But the difference is, like cherry, when you look at a quartered board, you will sometimes see almost, I describe it as like blurriness or like little hash marks in the cherry where the rays are just really, really tiny, and it just kind of adds a little shimmer to the surface. You just don't see that in alder because the rays are not spread out like you would find in cherry. They're grouped and lumped together there. So, certainly an alternate to this would be black cherry. But again, some of the paler alder could be in some ways a dead ringer for birch too, from a color perspective. Just be cautious. When you put a finish on birch, you get more of a yellow color, especially yellow birch. You put a finish on alder, red alder, you're going to get a redder color. So they may look similar in the raw form, but they can be colored a little bit different when finish goes under them. Hazel and hornbeam. Hornbeam, certainly the hardness is polar opposites, but from a color perspective, from a close grain perspective, similar. Hazel also the same way. Hazel's going to be a little bit wider, but similar from kind of a working property perspective. But again, hazel's not exactly found everywhere. But if you can find it, it's a fun wood. I may feature that in the future here. So range, like I said, it's a Pacific Northwest wood, native to the coastal regions of Western North America. So really, the natural range would span from like southeastern Alaska down through coastal British Columbia, Washington, and Oregon, and a little bit into central California, like maybe as far south as like the 34th parallel. Ultimately, it thrives in a moist, mild climate. So it prefers low elevations and found west of the Cascade Mountains in the U.S. because of that wetter coastal climate. Red alder does well in well-drained soils like river valleys and coastal plains. It will do okay in wetter areas, but what it's really known for is as a colonizing species, as a species that will come in after damage like fire or something and be the first one to sprout up. So if you remember the episode I did on the successional forests, this is the species like aspen and alder. They are the pioneers. They're the ones that come in on the scorched earth and start to sprout up fast. And because of that, I mean, this is not a super old tree. Really about 65 years old is really old age for alder, but it does grow rather fast. It can reach about 50 feet in 20 years in good sites. So that's the other reason that it's got a really, really stable price and a really stable supply, because a 20-year turn rate, that's awesome. When you look at a lot of hardwoods turning on a 40-year cycle, if this is turning on 20 years and getting good quality lumber out of the trees, that's awesome. But here again, it's improved soil fertility, nitrogen fixing in the root nodules. So foresters will actually go in and sometimes plant it if it's not being, nature doing the planting, in order to recoup fire scars and things like that. And then, of course, they grow a crop that's never intended to be there long term. They grow a crop in 20 to 30 years. They harvest it while the secondary succession takes over, and you get the maples and the birches and some of the other pines and softwoods kicking in as well. So I would say, like, contemporarily speaking, going back like 50 years, alder wasn't really a mainstream hardwood, commercially speaking. And it's really only very recently that it has become a mainstream hardwoods for interior applications, at least here in North America, but especially over the last few decades. So let's kind of look at some of its uses, some of them you might expect. Some of them are actually particularly interesting. So I think it makes sense to kind of go back in time, go way back, and look at how alder has been used through the years. So ultimately, if we go like way, way, way back, like indigenous peoples, like a lot of these species, there's a significant amount of lore and kind of cultural significance among the indigenous people, specifically of the Pacific Northwest. From like Alaska down through California, Native American tribes used red alder for medicine, for dye, for various crafts. The important part here, kind of like willow, the inner bark of alder has salicin, the stuff, the salicylic acid that we make aspirin from. So that was obviously used in medicines. The bark tea was used for poultices and things like that, for headaches and stomach issues and all that fun stuff. They used the wood, and again, think of this soft, like 600-ish Janka hardness. Wood was used for carving utensils. And this is where I first got exposure to alder, was actually in carving spoons. It's also been used for making dugout canoes, which, two ends of the spectrum there, from spoons and utensils to dugout canoes. But certainly the ease of carving, the ease of working with it, this goes all the way back to modern times. It's one of the reasons that alder, a mix. I guess that's the hybrid between poplar and alder. Alpler. I'm going to stop now. But yeah, this cultural value of the tree was really based around the fact that it was super easy to work. And I think the other parts, the medicinal parts, were kind of the side effect of using the entire tree. So as we kind of move forward into like the early 20th century, really at this point, alder, for the white man, was really undervalued. The Northwest timber industry was dominated by Douglas fir, cedar, really still is today. And red alder was kind of the weed tree, the trash tree. It sprang up in clear-cut areas. And oftentimes it was viewed kind of as an annoyance to the foresters, because they were back in there trying to replant the fir and the cedar, the conifers. So its commercial value was basically next to nothing as far back or as late into the 20th century as like the 1920s. Annual production of red alder at that point was on the order of like tens of thousands of board feet, like a tiny, tiny, tiny fraction of what you saw in other hardwoods. So primarily it was used for fuel. Some smoking, which you will still find today. Alder can actually be good for barbecues and things like that. But that was kind of it. It was used for smoking fish. And the rest of the time, it was just like we used it to keep warm. So fast forward a little bit into the late 1920s, and things started to kind of turn the corner a little bit. And we decided that, hey, there might be some more need for this. Now, was this brought on by the fact that there were constraints on other species? A lot of overlogging had just happened in the 1875 to like 1900, even to 1910 range, and really abuse of the softwood forestry in a lot of areas of the U.S., but primarily in like the Great Lakes states. And we're going to talk about that in a future episode. So it hadn't really reached as far west as the Pacific Northwest, but the beginning of the sustainability movement. And finally, people were starting to think, hey, we might actually run out of trees. Like up until that point, it was always, we're never going to run out of trees. You can just see them for as far as the eye can see. We just keep seeing more and more trees. Well, call it what you will, the rape of the lake states and the Northeast when it comes to things like white pine really opened people's eyes. And Teddy Roosevelt had just launched the national parks. Gifford Pinchot, his buddy, had just been appointed the director of the new department of the U.S. Forest Service. So this ecological mindset and sustainability and conservation was for the first time in the history of the world, was a thing. So now we were starting to look at some of the clear cutting practices that were still in place in the Pacific Northwest. And we were looking at this successional forest and starting to study things like hydrology and such, and how the forest responded or didn't respond when a large volume of trees were moved, and how the successional forest began to recoup the land from a perspective of how can we repair the damage that we, I want to say unknowingly did. We just never thought we would run out of trees. So this brought about kind of a rebirth, not just for alder, but a wide variety of species across the U.S. And what was previously seen as a trash tree that got in the way of replanting, or a tree that got in the way of clear cutting, suddenly realized, hey, maybe there's something we can do with this. And more importantly, what role is this playing in possibly regrowing a greater forestry? So that was kind of this major turning point that people started to begin to turn around for it. And really, since like 1920 to the present, it's become more of a mainstream hardwood. Certainly furniture and cabinetry is probably the most notable use of alder today. Case goods, that nice, attractive grain, but also its ability to take color, and it's kind of somewhat plain color to begin with is not going to overly influence things. So if I want to make it brown and kind of tint it towards the walnut side of things, if I want to make it more red and go with the cherry, if I want to keep it somewhat white and keep it kind of in the maple and the birch thing, there's a lot of flexibility with it. So cabinet doors, frame stock, furniture components, all kinds of stuff, even to today, is still what's being used. In the millwork and interior trim area, moldings, baseboard, door frames, paneling, and we're seeing it in flooring as well. Now, flooring, you can actually end up with a pretty clear version of this because just the small sizes and the one-face application of floors. So you can get not only a clear alder floor, but you can also get a knotty alder floor. And then, of course, veneer and plywood. Alder shows up quite a lot as a plywood core material. Just like we have poplar core plywood and aspen core plywood, we have alder core plywood. And as a pioneer species like aspen, it sprouts up really quickly and can actually be part of an overarching concession plan for a plywood mill, where you've got your foundational trees, and when they do their role and they colonize the land for the more successional trees to take over, the alder can be removed and peeled into hardwood. I personally have worked with alder plywood, and it's nice. Just put it that way. And a lot of the plywood mills in the Pacific Northwest, like Columbia Forest Products and things like that, are producing alder plywood. And it is a really nice, easy to work, but very consistent grain as an inner core. And certainly as a face veneer, it's a very uniform, pleasant, light, reddish brown appearance. So kind of like cherry plywood. But from the niche things that's shown up with alder is it's huge in electric guitars, like solid body guitars. The Fender Stratocaster, a lot of the Stratocasters are made using alder. And why? Well, I mean, first of all, it's very lightweight. So long jam sessions, nice and comfortable, very easy to work with and shape, which was nice. But due to the stable, consistent nature of the grain, you actually end up with a very stable, broad range of tones. So you've got this very balanced, full body tone, not like overly warm and somewhat twangy like mahogany, but also not overly bright like some of the ash and maple guitars. It's kind of that Goldilocks tone wood due to the lower hardness, but the somewhat dense nature of things. You get this mellow tone. So kind of a punchy, clear, but I guess you would call it versatile tone. Adapts pretty much to any genre. There's rock, blues, or jazz guitar, or whatever. So you're finding it thrown across a lot of things, to the point where even as you move into like metal, it actually handles distortion pretty well. And this is where some of the iconic Stratocasters, even the Jazzcasters, they used alder bodies, and it gives it that kind of, I don't know, call it sonic identity that is the classic Fender sound. The notes stay nice and defined even under that distortion that I was talking about earlier with some of the metal stuff, because of this kind of, the mids are kind of scooped out. Nice, steady, controlled bass, nice, ringy, high tones, but that mid area is what really kind of pulls it all together. Instead of being overly punchy in the middle, like you might find in some of the folk guitars, or even moving into things like mandolins and such, this just kind of, Goldilocks of tone wood. I don't know. I've talked about tone woods before, and I was particularly interested in alder. And I know a lot of people that I talked to about who work with alder, who said the first time they worked with it was actually in making a solid body guitar. So it's a great beginner guitar kit. And if you bought a guitar kit, you're going to find alder shows up a lot because it's just so easy to work with. Certainly, even today, we're still using it for utensils, carving stock, even picture frames. I showed up quite a lot. Not really. I mean, there's always some market that's making pallets and crates from it, but that secondary wood thing is kind of a thing of the past for alder. It's been elevated into somewhat more, quote, fine woodworking type tastes. Another kind of niche market is the sauna market. Red Alder is used for sauna interiors, benches, paneling, and it's offering a performance it's on par with like your traditional cedars. And a lot of this is because of the low heat conductivity of alder. So the bench surfaces stay colorful. If you go and sit on your naked butt on the sauna bench, you're not going to burn yourself. It's also very, very low in resin, so you don't get any kind of stickiness or weeping under high heat. And as I said earlier, while alder I wouldn't classify as an exterior wood, it does extraordinarily well when it's exposed to constant moisture. So the Venice pilings, that, does great. It's sunken like that. In a sauna environment where it's just wet and hot all the time, it actually does extraordinarily well. It handles that humidity very well and stays very stable with a high amount of resistance to warping, doing through that heat, high moisture cycle. So yes, it may not be as inherently rot resistant as something like cedar, but it is in fact water repellent enough for that indoor sauna use. Proper ventilation of the sauna could be kind of an important part. And this is where we're seeing thermal modified wood taking over, but we're also seeing a lot of thermal modifiers thermally modifying alder and kind of belt and suspendering the approach. So alder makes a good heat conductivity wood. Thermal modify it, and you've got even more moisture resistance from it. So you will find that now, like, saunas are like everywhere in Europe. Scandinavians started, and now they're everywhere. Heck, they're everywhere in the U.S. now. I mean, my doctor says, get a sauna. So now we're seeing thermal modifiers using Alden all over the place. Aspen as well, with thermally modifying aspen. I know Thermery, the thermal modifier, the brand Thermery, modifies both aspen and sauna specifically for their classic sauna line of woods. So the limitation of this in a sauna perspective is it's slightly less than Western Red Cedar, simply because of just the sheer volume of Western Red Cedar, not just the amount of trees, but also the size of that industry. It's enormous. Like most of Canada is felling Western Red Cedar, or certainly Atlantic White Cedar. Alder is still a relatively small market compared to Western red cedar. It's a robust market. It's a very, very stable market, but compared to a giant like Western red cedar, and literally, physically, the size of the Western red cedar is a giant compared to the more diminutive alder, which you would classify like as a pioneer, but also kind of an understory tree. You're going to get a lot more yield from a log for Western red cedar, which is why it's still kind of holding a large part of that market. There's also just a certain traditional element of that smell of cedar in a sauna, but I'd be willing to bet you're going to see alder start to take market share hand over fist from the Western red cedar, because Western red cedar prices are skyrocketing at this point. And this is, tariffs don't help the situation, but it's been skyrocketing long before tariffs. The price of cedar without tariffs is skyrocketing. Alder, nice and steady and stable and cheap. Even the thermal modified stuff is cheap. When you've got a relatively inexpensive wood that's thermal modified, yes, it will be more expensive, but when you start with a more expensive wood and modify it, yikes. That's what some of the high price points in thermal modified lumber comes from today. Whereas alder, nice and steady. So yeah, it's an incredibly versatile wood for interior woodwork. It's got cool tonalities. It's got sauna uses. It's kind of the Pacific Northwest's mahogany. It does a lot of things really, really well. Nice, fine, even, consistent grain throughout. It's a cool species. If you haven't had a chance to work with alder, seek it out. You're finding it more and more available all across North America. It's even, like I said, being exported to Europe. And if you're in Europe, look up the European alder, Alnus glutinosa. It's a very similar, in fact, even more weather resistant than the stuff that we have here in North America. Okay. I think it goes without saying, but for those of you who sponsor this show and support the show on Patreon, if you are a Walnut tier member, you're going to get the sticker that I'm showing on screen as soon as I figure out which way to point on screen. I'm going to be shipping these out. Anyone who became a member in January, you're going to be getting one of these lovely stickers. So I'll take that kind of second to throw in my little mid-roll commercial. Thank you guys for continuing to support the show. Thank you for sending in questions. I'm about to answer a few questions right now. If you have more questions, by all means, send them to me. You can email me, lumberupdate@gmail.com. You can slide into my DMs on Instagram at lumber update show, or you can just go to lumberupdate.com, fill out the contact form, submit your question that way. I love to hear them, and thank you for everyone who does support the show. Patreon.com/lumberupdate. You're going to get your stickers. Yay, stickers. So, questions. I have an interesting question here from Rob, who shared an article, and I can't remember where it came from. It's a news site that it's one of those like subscription only things. Like I got a chance to read it once and then it kicked me out and said, you got to sign in and subscribe. So I'm not going to share it on screen, but this is primarily an audio podcast anyway. But quoting, essentially this is about American sawmills exporting black walnut over to Asia where it's being, or excuse me, exporting black walnut logs over to Asia where it's being sawn into boards and re-exported back to the U.S. and in some instances undercutting North American mills. So to quote from the article, they're talking to a North American sawyer here, and he says, for some reason, the U.S. sells logs to Vietnam, then Vietnam is milling American walnut, selling it as American walnut, and undercutting finished American walnut from the U.S., but coming from Vietnam. So Vietnam is paying their people almost nothing at the tariffs, and we, American sawyers, are now less competitive. And the article is really saying Pennsylvania loggers, Ohio loggers, et cetera, want a bailout from the executive administration because they say without it, mass layoffs could be next. And certainly infrastructure and manpower is extremely important for maintaining the lumber industry. So Rob asked the question, is it really possible for Vietnam to undercut the price of American grown walnut? I find it hard to believe that the cost of shipping the logs to Vietnam and then shipping the finished lumber back to the U.S. does not eat up the difference between U.S. labor and Vietnamese labor. So I did some digging. I made some calls, looked at some shipping costs, looked at some sawing costs, called a few mills that we've worked with in Southeast Asia, some teak mills we've worked with in Vietnam and Thailand, and even talked to my domestic buyer about log prices and confirming that there is some exporting going on here. So spoiler alert, I think the conclusion is that even though Asian labor is cheaper, shipping back to the US kind of sort of erases most of those savings, making the Asian walnut anywhere from 20 to 80% more expensive overall per board foot once ocean freight is added. So how is this possibly undercutting it? So let's just break down some of the numbers here. Sawmilling costs about, let's see, we're compared here. So about 50 cents to $1 per board foot to actually saw it. The freight anywhere from 60 to $1.20 per board foot on top of that. That's in, and then shipping it to the container is probably, I don't know, shipping the container to the US, $1,800 all the way up to like $6,500. Huge range. Shipping's all over the place. So that could add like $20 to $60 per board foot, depending on how much you put in that container. So total delivered cost, US, just to saw it and put it on trucks and ship it domestically, the shipping side of that is, like I said, about 50 cents to $1 per board foot. Whereas the Asian shipping cost is 80 cents to $1.80 per board foot. So certainly the US stuff is cheaper no matter how you shake it. So to Rob's point, he finds it hard to believe that they can do that. No, that is hard to believe because they can't. It still costs more. US sawmills are cheaper overall, even though Asian labor is lower. Asia only becomes cost effective if the logs originate in Asia. Put a pin in that. We're going to get to that. Or if you need like any kind of value added labor, like additional milling, S4Sing, E4Ing, putting additional joiner on it or something like that before you ship it. Now the margin can be absorbed and that lower labor cost could take that away from what you might have to do in the US. For walnut specifically, the shipping cost dominates this and it kind of wipes out all of that milling savings. So the easy answer to this question is no, it's not possible to do this. The shipping costs erase all that labor and milling savings. Granted, Vietnam prices have lowered significantly very recently when China moved all of its operations to Vietnam to dodge tariffs. So it only ends up cheaper if the logs originated in Asia. So there's something to be said about legacy stock that was exported to Asia like a while ago, years ago. To the point where the cost isn't really associated with the sale price. More likely, though, the logs were exported to China, who absorbed the cost of that. And then when China moved its sawing operations down in Vietnam, they just kind of did like an intercompany transfer, and there was no cost associated with those logs when it hit the Vietnamese mill. So the Vietnamese sawed it and sold it at a price that does not account for the expenses to import the log. Therefore, it is really much cheaper, but essentially it's all smoke and mirrors. It's not a long-term strategy. Walnut is such a super premium market right now where FAS grade is barely, if at all, acceptable. We want more than that, and we're going to answer a question about that in a minute. The quality grade of the Vietnamese sawn stuff of walnut is very, very poor compared to what's being sawn in the U.S. market. So there again, you may go to a yard and buy, it's still an FAS board, but it's going to be a much higher quality FAS board, netting a higher price. Whereas maybe I didn't find a lot of FAS coming out of Vietnam. It was like common select at best. That price is automatically going to be lower. So what we may be seeing is a knee-jerk reaction to, oh my gosh, the cost of Vietnamese walnut is so much lower without actually looking at it. Because a lot of times it's going to be brought in on a broker basis, sight unseen, and it could end up just being total crap. If it is decent, it's because they're using up existing stock where, again, that cost is just kind of evaporated over time. I don't know what the official accountant word is. Yeah, you get it. You bought something so long ago, you don't feel the cost anymore. There is another issue to deal with, though. The sawmill business is extremely tough. It's got a very high overhead, very, very low margins. And this is why so many mills in the US and Canada are either closing or they're making a move towards more value-added services. It used to be that a sawmill just sawed into boards, shipped off the green lumber, somebody else dried it, somebody else S4S'd it, somebody else straight line ripped it. Now we're seeing more and more sawmills that are doing this and adding those services and increasing their profit margin. So log exporting was kind of another thing you could do. When those mills, all they did was saw into boards and ship the green lumber, their margin was really, really low. So when somebody came to them and said, hey, I'll buy all your logs, you don't have to incur the labor. So say they're buying walnut logs, I don't know, we'll say $850 per 1,000 board foot. Once the log is scaled, we'll say, something like that, 850. It might be more like 1050, sometimes even 1,200 per 1,000 board foot. Say they're buying them for that, and they're incurring, what did we say, 50 cents to $1 in cost per board foot to mill it. Well, if they can not incur that cost and get someone to buy their entire stock and ship it off to Asia, that sounds kind of attractive. But if you incur the cost of milling it and then incur the cost of additional value-added services, that's an exponential profit curve, because things like straight line ripping, surfacing, even skip planing are premium services that add a lot. They require specialized machinery. Yes, they require labor, but they more than pay for themselves, and they add to your margin pretty significantly. Logs are cheap, folks. Green lumber, really cheap. Kiln-dried lumber, not cheap, especially kiln-dried walnut. Kiln-dried walnut that's been S2S'd or S4S'd, holy crap, your margin just climbed a steep exponential curve and you're making a lot more. So if you're exporting logs, and this is easy for me to say, I don't work for a sawmill, I work for somebody who buys boards, and I know that it's a tough industry to play with, but more and more of these sawmills that I talk to have gone to value-added services. They recognize that exporting their logs is cutting their nose off. And they're much better to incur a little bit more cost and sell at a higher price. I know we personally used to buy a lot of green domestics and dry it ourselves, and the sawmills have gotten a lot better at drying to the point where we trust their quality control. I can buy it and I can turn it really fast instead of letting it sit in my air dry yard for 3 months and then sitting in a kiln for 2 weeks, which is just eating up money, especially when I'm bringing in other material that I don't trust the quality of drying and I need to use my kilns for that. If I can bring in walnut already kiln dried, I'm going to do it. It ends up being a big cost savings for me, and it adds value to the sawmills, which as long as the sawmills stay in the black and stay robust, I can continue to get supply. So it's all this long interconnected chain. So I think that the answer to this, Rob, is no, you can't erase that price. If there is walnut out there that's cheaper, it's very short-lived. And I know that's easy to say to a walnut mill that might be losing a lot of business due to Vietnamese lumber, Vietnamese walnut specifically. I think once a few customers buy it and recognize the quality, the grade, even the dryness is not where they need it to be, they're going to come back. Or more importantly, that supply, like a lot of stuff coming out of Asia, isn't consistent. And it's kind of flash in the pan, and they're opportunistic in the stuff that they're sawing, and give it a year or two and they may not have any left, or they can't afford to export it anymore. Or who knows, there'll be another tariff on that. So hard to say. So interesting question, Rob. I appreciate you sending that in. So let's dig a little deeper into walnut. Jesse sent me this question. Jesse is a Patreon supporter, so thank you, Jesse. You'll be getting your Alder sticker. Jesse works for a millwork house. They do doors, windows, cabinets, things like that. So let me just read his email here. He says, we've been fighting the good fight with walnut over the years. Our impression is grading is getting tighter and more grades are being offered at different price points, which I find as a good thing. So FAS, like I said, used to be the top grade. Now we've got these kind of anecdotal grades, pattern grade and all heart grade and things like that don't really exist in the NHL handbook, but it allows us to put some sort of milestone in and say, okay, instead of, well, this FAS is $8 a board foot and this FAS is $15 a board foot. And the person's like, what the hell? What's the difference? Well, this $15 a board foot is a superior grade or a clear pattern grade. Again, not official grades, but at least it's a modifier that we can say, here's why the price point is different. So Jesse says, aside from FAS, we are seeing 90-70 red oak rules, 90-90 red oak rules, Red oak is a much clearer species than walnut. So its grading rules are much tighter as far as how many defects are allowed. Walnut really lax on how many defects are allowed. So when you grade walnut on red oak rules, you're holding that walnut to the same clarity standards as a naturally clear and straight grain species. So when you say walnut graded on red oak rules, that is already significantly better than an FAS walnut using walnut rules. When you're talking about the 90-70, 90-90, this is all about the clarity that you can see in one face over the other. So 90% clear one face, 70% clear on the back face, 90-70, 90-90, 90% clear one face, 90% clear on the back face. Some will also refer to that as a hardwood thing, but that's kind of a different thing where now I'm saying I want red oak, FAS red oak rules, but all heart, or 90-10 heart sap. But when you're seeing things like, obviously 90-70 doesn't add up to 100. If the fraction adds up to 100, they're probably referring to heartwood versus sapwood. But if it's something like 90-70, 90-90, that adds up to something more than 100. That's referring to clarity of one face and clarity of the back face. He goes on to say that, quote, super prime, end quote, and other names the mills come up with to market their premium walnut grades are now becoming more common. Although even these seem to be a bit hit or miss from time to time, which has brought me to my current situation. Question. Our local lumber reseller gave us a bad batch that did not meet the 90-50 grade as advertised. So we no longer trusted the mill they got it from. And while looking for a walnut source, we searched and found another manufacturer that on the website, they list mills that offer high-end specs on 90-70 or 90-90 walnut. We did our due diligence, found a mill we liked, and from phone conversations, we made a purchase of 6,000 board feet of 4/4, 5/4, 8/4. In the first two packs, it appears that the grade of 90-70 was met. However, all the lumber is purple and will not be accepted by our customer. The walnut came from Michigan. We hear Iowa is the best for walnut, but what am I missing? I thought we did everything right by finding the best grade, never thinking color would have been an issue. Is this standard for Michigan? Purple walnut, that is? Is this a drying or a steaming related issue? The vendor says they will take it back, but we haven't crossed that bridge yet. We are currently scrambling to bring in another $60,000 of lumber from other vendors and flipping a coin, hoping something will work. It is jobs like this that can break a company. You're talking about a small millwork shop that's got a big walnut door order and they're buying $60,000, worth of lumber. They've already spent a bunch on lumber that's not working. And, maybe the company will take it back, but in the meantime, they're still having to buy more. So they could be on the hook. He didn't say what the first amount was, but let's just say it's 60 grand as well. This small millwork shop could be on the hook for $120,000 and they haven't gotten paid once or milled a single board yet. It's very common this happens. So, he sent me some pictures and I wanted to show this walnut here. So the color tones didn't show up well on camera. So I did the best I can do. The first pic, and that's what I'm showing on screen right now, has on the left has a veneer and it's essentially their control sample. And the boards underneath it and to the right have the purple hues that they're describing. So he sent a couple other pictures, some close-ups that show some of the variation and such. So first of all, and the first thing I said to him is you got to recognize if you're using veneers, your control sample, that's a bit of a fool's errand because veneer, A, being thinner, it's not going to look quite the same in color, but B, veneer is not solid wood lumber. It's sourced entirely differently. Veneer logs are intercepted before it ever makes it to a sawmill, oftentimes identified in the forest by the foresters that did the survey in the first place. Veneer buyers know exactly what they're looking for in a log form. That log never makes it to a sawmill. That goes from the forest straight to a peeling mill, where it's either rotary peeled or it's cut and guillotine sliced into like sequence matched flitches. Entirely different species. It's like, 1 out of 500 logs is what they're buying. The truly greatest thing you could ever imagine walnut looking like. Then it's sliced super, super thin, and it's dried 100% uniform, which is also going to really homogenize the color. It's going to pull out a lot of those extractives and things that would come from a thicker board. So when we talk about steaming walnut to kind of blend the colors and remove some of the purple and the green hues and things, you're doing the same thing when you slice it to 1/10 of an inch and dry it. All that stuff is leaching out. So you get this more mellow, chocolatey brown, uniform color in veneer. So the first thing I would say is if you're using veneer as your control sample, that is a slippery slope. It's not to say you can't find solid, thicker wood that won't look like that veneer, but you're not going to find a lot of it. You're not going to find any kind of massive quantity of it. So the boards underneath it certainly have, and in the image that I've got on screen, they're kind of a little bit more red, but think of like freshly milled purple heart, or no, not freshly milled, like aged purple heart. So it goes from that bright purple color to the kind of that amaranthine reddish purple color. That's the undertone of this stuff. And that's what he's talking about. And when you see the veneer piece, it's that deep chocolatey brown compared to the purple stuff, that won't fly. Now there is a safe bet that this material will mellow over time. I have that conversation all day long, and it's completely a moot point because people just, they don't want to wait and they don't want to take that chance. Because in this case, they're going to be cutting this into derails and styles to make doors. What if it doesn't mellow over time? Because every time you mill it, you're kind of resetting that mellowing clock. So they could sink a lot of money into this. First of all, once they start cutting it, they can't send it back. So they sink a lot of money into this. And what if it doesn't mature? What if it doesn't mellow out in color? And then they've got either door parts or worse, doors that the customer's not going to accept, and that will break a company like this. So it's a tough thing to say, stick it out in the sun, because yeah, you do that, but the minute you then run it over the joiner, that color comes back. And it's really hard to say, how long do you wait? Yeah, that's a tough thing to kind of convince somebody, whether you are a millwork house and certainly a homeowner, when you tell them it's going to change color over time, they look at you like you've got 6 heads. Like, you know, what kind of undercoat are you trying to sell me, eh? I don't know what accent that was. I think I was trying to do Fargo there, but forgive me. Minnesotans, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. Anyway, here's an image, though, that Jesse sent me of the finished door. So actually, let me put both images on screen here. Again, for those of you listening, I'm so sorry, but this is just the way things are. But the good news is I'm covering up my face. You don't have to look at me. So on the right, we've got these kind of purple toned walnuts. And on the left, we've got a raw, unfinished door, but deep brown, chocolate brown. And the undertones here are more kind of yellow creamy, not purple creamy. And this is, you know, it's still American black walnut. It's still the same stuff that we're buying. Turns out, in the end, they did find that other source they recognized and were looking to buy came from a different area. And it comes down to soil chemistry. What are the trees in that region growing? So you'll say, well, here the best stuff is in Iowa. I've heard the same thing from walnut, but from Pennsylvania. And I've heard, oh, no, the best walnut comes from New York. Although 1,000 canker is a bit of a problem in New York right now, so maybe not for long. Walnut from different regions is going to have different characteristics, and that's all due to the growing conditions, the amount of sunlight those trees get, the general soil chemistry, how much rain they've had, how much snow they had, how much runoff they had, and that will change things. So that one mill that they bought this from that was somewhat purple, the next load you buy from could be perfectly fine because of when that was felled or where it was felled. The problem here, and back to his original point, they did everything right as far as finding these above FAS grades and really tightening that grade to find the right stuff, and they paid a pretty penny for it. But what those 90, 70, what those Red Oak Rule grades don't touch is color. Veneer grades kind of sort of will touch on it, but veneer buyers will also focus on color. But they also know that they can kind of alter the color based on how they dry it. The little black magic of veneering is how quickly it's dried, and in the environment that's dried can also help control some of that color. There is no grading system on the books or off the books that I know of that will really address the color side of things. So if that's going to be important to you, yes, look at things like grading on maple rules, grading on red oak rules, and look at 90-90, 90-70 type grades, but then have the next conversation. Once you identify that 90-90 that will match, then come to them and say, what's the color tint like? Send me some pictures of that wood so they got an idea of what the color was like. Or if possible, send me, 3 or 4 boards from the pack that I can mill and check the color on. Or if you can mill it for me and take pictures of it. The problem in taking pictures is sometimes the color is a little hard to determine. So if possible, ask your supplier if you can just get a small amount. And many of them will send you samples for free. They'll send you, an 8-foot board or 2, especially if you're looking to buy $60,000 worth of lumber. It's something that you can pull off and you can take a closer look at the color. Then you can go back to them and say, this meets the grade, but it's too purple, too red. Do you have something that's more chocolatey brown? Instead of saying, well, we want the color to be consistent, but if you don't know what the color is, or more importantly, you don't have an example of a color. So in this instance, we had some boards that had that purple color and he put the veneer over top of it. And side by side, if I just looked at that piece of veneer and I'd say, well, we want it chocolatey brown, then I went and looked at a more purple walnut board, you might think they look the same. But when you put one on top of the other side by side, you can very much see the difference. So if you know what color you're looking for and have some sort of control, even if it is a veneer, it's useful asking that mill to send you a piece that you can mill and then put your control sample right next to it. Then you send that image back to the mill and say, that's not the right match. Here's what I'm going for. Do you have something that's a little bit more brown? It's still going to be difficult to pull off. And there's no question, all of this costs money, folks. It's just raising the cost per board foot, but at least you're having a more meaningful conversation instead of just, well, we wish it was less purpley. I wish it was more brown. Well, what does that mean? What does more brown mean? So, sometimes what's the expression? Break a few eggs to make an omelet. You got to mill a few boards and hold it up next to a control sample or something in order to get it right. In this case, I think through experience, they found out what they were looking for. They explained to the mill, here's the problem they were having. And the doors that they produced, oh my God, these are drop dead, gorgeous, color consistent doors. And there's a lot more of these that Jesse sent me pictures of. So first of all, Jesse, you guys did amazing work. That is one seriously lucky customer to get those doors. But I think the whole journey you went through is a great example. And thank you, Jesse, for writing in. I did check with him that I could send him, that I could use these questions. He's like, that's why I wrote in. So thank you for that. I never want to be assumptive on that, but this is a really cool story. And yes, we're talking, millwork houses here and $60,000 orders and stuff, but you can scale this experience up or down. And certainly if you're only buying one board and you're asking a sawyer to do a bunch of this stuff, yeah, they're probably going to charge you for it. But if you are buying in larger volumes, you can ask these type of questions and start asking questions about color, because color consistency is nowhere in a grade. All heart, percentage of heart versus sap tells you something, but it doesn't tell you the actual color or the color variation of the heart itself. So very, very cool question and a nice insight into just the state of the millwork trade as it stands now, and why I kind of laugh at NHLA grades. We need them. You need a place to start, but FAS is just so not what it used to be. It is the top grade. I shouldn't say not what it used to be. It's still the same. The grading rules have changed a little bit, but the demands and our tolerance for color consistency and clarity has just gotten higher or tighter and tighter and tighter and tighter. Some of this could be powered by the architectural design community. There are veneer manufacturers out there who push out veneer samples that interior designers keep in a little binder. And they're like, oh, we want walnut because this is what walnut looks like. When they open the 3-ring binder of their beautiful piece of veneer, and they expect all of their stuff to look like that. That's the Rift White Oak market in a snapshot right there. Eventually, we're going to figure out some grading systems that will start to address this. And we're getting there with like Red Oak rules, 90-70, 90-90, like Jesse talked about. Getting up into color, that's a highly subjective thing. And there's a lot of people who just see color differently. And it's not a matter of being colorblind or not. We just all see color differently. And photographs don't do it justice. So it may be a while, but I think we're going to start to get to the point where we at least can develop a process to help us with our color consistency. The good news is there's still a huge army of us who really don't care. And we love the inconsistency and we love the high variability and we love the knots and the character grades. And we continue to use those. And with the growth of the urban sawing market, we're going to see more and more of that stuff not going to waste and possibly consuming more of it for your average user and leaving that really, really hyper color specific type stuff available for the high-end architectural grades. And we're not going to be competing against one another. The DIY guy who doesn't care what the walnut looks like because he just needs one board is not going to be buying up the super premium stuff because he's just as happy with the regular FAS. That would be a nice kind of symbiotic relationship, allowing the super high-end architectural grades to coexist with the dude in his garage. So I think that'll do it for me. I do appreciate really great questions this time. I appreciate all of you guys writing in and sending me questions, sending me feedback type stuff. Love it.
Shannon's Lumber
Meantime,
Industry Update.
pay for it. We'll see you next time, folks.